All right. Is everyone awake? I want to check to make sure everyone's awake out there. Everyone's up. Everyone's awake. Fantastic. I see hands. All right. Okay. So I've got some good news and I've got some bad news for everyone in the room. Um, the bad news is it's the year 3019, and you've all been being held in a maximum security prison for the last 20 so years. And we've been tampering with your memories. I hate to reveal that. I'm sorry, you're all convicted murderers. You're all convicted murderers, and you've been sentenced to life in prison. So that's the bad news, kind of a downer. But there's good news. The good news is it's the future. It's the year 3019, and we're very humane in the future. In the future, we have this thing called an experience machine. And so what we can do is we can plug you all in to this experience machine, and then you get to live a life in virtual reality. So the wife that you think you married, she doesn't exist. Sorry. Your favorite restaurant, that's a computer simulation. Your pet dog, just pixels in a computer simulation. It's all fake. So you've been living in this virtual reality for the last 20 years, but the lawyers, those damn lawyers, those lawyers force us to wake everyone up every 10 years. We have to unplug everyone from the experience machine. And I'm required by law to ask you whether you want to return to the real world or go back to the experience machine to continue your prison sentence. So here's your choice. On the one hand, you can live in a 6x8 prison cell with tasteless gruel served 3 times a day. Or on the other hand, we can plug you right back into the experience machine, and you can pick from a selection of fulfilling lives. For example, you can be a famous poet or a great actor, or even the president of the United States. Not Trump, probably, but some president. It's up to you. You can pick the president. You can be whoever you want, and you can have just as fulfilling of a life as you want. All right. So here's my question for you. How many people want to exit the experience machine and return to reality? In other words, you want to return to your actual 6x8 prison cell. Can you raise your hand if you want out of the experience machine? Just curious. Anyone out there? Not seeing. Oh, hey, I got one hand. Elena is coming back. Okay, sounds good. And I guess Kathleen's coming back. Nice. All right. Kyle. Okay. So people are abandoning now like crazy. All right. And how many people want to continue their life in virtual reality? Any strong takers for virtual? Oh, Jack does. And good for you. Okay. So sounds good. All right. Okay. So this is a thought experiment, which we'll talk about a little more moving on. This is Robert Nozick's thought experiment. He's a Harvard professor of philosophy, wrote Anarchy, State, and Utopia. It's a familiar thought experiment, right? It comes up in films and in stories, science fiction stories all the time. There's variants of it. Let me talk about some of those variants now. You've probably all heard of the Orgasmatron. That's from the 1974 science fiction movie by Woody Allen, Sleeper. In that movie, there's this Orgasmatron, which is a large cylinder that you walk into, and then you feel intense pleasure. Apparently, they've gotten rid of all sex in the future. It's all done through the Orgasmatron. But let's imagine that the Orgasmatron was actually invented. It's a new device that Apple introduces, the iOrgasmatron, and it has no negative impact on people at all. You spend all day, every day in the Orgasmatron. The question, of course, that comes up is, should you do it? Is that a good thing to do for the rest of your life? The reason why philosophers are interested in this question is a lot of philosophers believe that happiness is the sole and ultimate goal of life. And so if you accept that, like, for example, Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, he writes in the opening sentence of his book, quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do." So that doesn't leave a lot of room. If you're making a decision about what you want to do with your life, figure out which will give you the greatest pleasure. So it sounds like a, universal subscription, long-term subscription to the Orgasmatron is the way to go. Just out of curiosity, how many of you would live a life in Orgasmatron? Is anyone willing to raise their hand on that? No. Okay. I don't see anyone. I guess I'm looking out. Oh, Brentwood. Okay. Good for you, Brent. All right. Good to know. All right. So let's talk a little more about how Robert Nozick describes this experiment. Again, he discusses it in his 1974 book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. According to Nozick, the point of the thought experiment is to answer the question, what else can matter to us other than how our lives feel from the inside? Now, that seems like a weird way of phrasing the question, how our lives feel from the inside. But it makes sense. Hopefully, it'll make sense by the end of the talk, because from his perspective, he's actually asking, was it enough if our sort of internal experience of the world makes us happy? Does it have to actually reflect anything in the real world beyond our sort of internal experience of reality? But let's linger for a moment longer on this question. What are we really asking here? Another way of phrasing this is to ask the question, is a good life the same as a happy life? In other words, is the most important goal in life happiness? In his book, The Examined Life, this is a great book, by the way, another book by Nozick, he writes, some theorists have claimed that happiness is the only important thing about life. All that should matter to a person, they say, is being happy. The sole standard for assessing a life is amount or quantity of happiness it contains. So Nozick's goal with his thought experiment is to question the idea that the only important thing in life is happiness. And this is really what this talk is about. Okay, so of course, there's a lot of alternative versions of this thought experiment. I'm just going to go through them because they're fun. They pop up all over the place. But everyone remembers The Matrix, right? The Matrix, the scene with Cypher sitting in a simulated restaurant. I rewatched that thing on YouTube this morning because it's so much fun. Here's the quote from the movie. You know, this steak doesn't exist. I know that when I put it in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that's juicy and delicious. After 9 years, you know what I realized? Ignorance is bliss. This scene he's doing he has a big fork with a big red, hunk of steak at the end of it. It's a beautiful scene. Or another place where this thought experiment comes up is The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, another great movie. You'll remember in that the two characters played by Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet have a bad relationship, so they decide to erase each other from their memories so that they can forget the painful details of the relationship, and so they rewrite their past to make their current life happier. Another example, this is a less far-fetched example. This could actually come up for people. This comes up in the philosophical literature, The Father of the Soldier. In this example, imagine that a good friend of yours is an old man. His son, who he loves, has been drafted and sent off to war. You intercept a letter from the government stating that the son has died a horrible death from mustard gas. You have the opportunities to substitute the letter. You can pretend to be the son and write that you have found a French girl and fell in love and decide to live the remainder of your life in Paris. And then the question is, should you do that? Should you substitute the letter and then convince your friend that his son, who he loves very much, hasn't died, but is, off in Paris having a good time for the rest of his life? And then finally, I'm going to throw this in. Another movie I really like, Ricky Gervais' Invention of Lying. I was rewatching some of that this morning too. This is in the Invention of Lying. There's only one person in the world who can lie. That's Ricky Gervais. And of course, he takes advantage of that like crazy. But there's a really touching scene where his mother is dying in the hospital. And she says, people don't talk about death, but it's a horrible thing, an eternity of nothingness. That's what she says as she's dying in her hospital bed. And Ricky Gervais, he looks around, and remember, he can lie. So at that moment, you can see his brain thinking, he's looking at his mother, who he loves so much. And he said, you're wrong about what happens after you die. You go to your favorite place in the whole world, and everyone you have ever known or who has ever loved you will be there. And then he goes on and he says, oh, you'll be young again. You'll be running. You'll live in a beautiful mansion. It'll just be, fantastic. And of course, you feel for him because his mother's dying and he's trying to say the right words to make her happy for the last few moments that she's alive. All right. So these are all similar, right? These are all ways to manipulate reality in such a way to make people happy. And they raise the question over and over again. If happiness is the only objective, then what's wrong with these things? Why not just, go with these fake versions of reality if it'll make everyone happier? All right, so let's talk about Nozick, because he's the one who brought up the experience machine. And so he has 3 arguments against it. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. But what he says, which I'm curious about your reaction, but he says he assumes that anyone faced with the decision to choose between the experience machine and the real world will pick the real world. We just saw, who was it? I think it was Brent who was going for being Cypher in the Matrix. So obviously that's not universally true. But he writes, we care about more than just how things feel to us from the inside. There's more to life than feeling happy. We care about what it is, what is actually the case. We want certain situations we value, prize, and think important to actually hold and be so. We want our beliefs, or certain of them, to be true and accurate. We want our emotions, or certain important ones, to be based upon facts that hold and to be fitting. We want to be importantly connected to reality, not to live in a delusion. All right. And he has 3 arguments that he brings up for why people should reject the experience machine. Argument number 1, this is a quote: first, we want to do certain things and not just have the experience of doing them. So, it's not enough just to have the illusion of eating some steak. We actually want to eat steak. Or probably a better example is, it's not enough to think you climbed Everest. You want to actually climb Mount Everest. Argument number 2. A second reason for not plugging in is that we want to be a certain way, to be a certain sort of person. Someone floating in a tank is just an indeterminate blob. Okay, so no one wants to be a blob. Argument number 3. Thirdly, plugging into an experience machine limits us to a man-made reality, to a world no deeper or more important than that which people can construct. All right, so I should just say up front, I don't find any of these 3 arguments very convincing. Just want to push back by making a couple of points. Response number 1, Nozick originally wrote about the experience machine back in the 1970s. Unlike people today, he didn't grow up in the virtual worlds of Minecraft, Halo, or World of Warcraft. He doesn't seem to think that someone can experience fear or bravery in a virtual world. People are living in a different world today. My children have spent a huge chunk of their life in virtual reality, in Minecraft and other games, and they have, heroic fights every day. So I think probably people's relationships with computers have changed over time. The other response I have is empirical studies just do not support Nozick's claim that people would choose the actual world over the experience machine. They actually did a survey, an empirical survey. Hendricks and Duvin found that given a choice between living a very unhappy life in a maximum security prison and the experience machine, 87% of people would choose the experience machine. So overall, people will pick the simulated steak over reality. Okay, but even though I don't find Nozick's particular arguments particularly convincing, I do agree with his overall claim that happiness is not everything. So Nozick writes, the question of whether to plug in to this experience machine is a question of value. The question is not whether plugging in is preferable to extreme dire alternatives, lives of torture, for instance, but whether plugging in would constitute the very best life or tie for being best, because all that matters about our life is how it feels from the inside. That's the way he poses his question. So when considering the experience machine, it's important to distinguish 2 questions. On the one hand, what people would actually do, and then the other question is what people should do. In other words, there's a descriptive versus a normative question that we need to distinguish here. So it's not enough just to know 87% of people would pick the experience machine. They could all be idiots. They could be making a bad decision. So we actually want to make sure they're making, the right decision here. Cypher in the Matrix is quite happy to eat assimilated steaks, but we don't admire Cypher. We think he's morally defective and shallow, or at least I do. All right. So another good way to think about the question about the experience machine is to think about things that we continue to care about even after we die. Because if the only goal of life is to experience happiness, and you believe that happiness is just a subjective mental state, then you really shouldn't care about anything that happens after you die, A dead person just doesn't have any mental experiences. So things that happen after you die should have no impact on your happiness, given our current definition of happiness. But people do, in fact, care very much about things that happen after they die. For example, people care about the people they love. I want my wife and children to be happy even after I die. It's not like, okay, after my funeral, I don't care. Whatever happens, happens. This is true even though their lives they lead after my death can have no impact on my psychological happiness because, I'm dead. So it doesn't really matter there. But it does matter to me that they have a happy life even after I'm dead. People also care about the projects that they're engaged in. If I was an author, I might care very much about whether people continue to read my books after I die. I want my books to be read for hundreds of years, even if I'm not around to bask in the fame, right? Projects matter to me. And people care about causes even after they die. For example, I might be very concerned about climate change, even if some of the major negative consequences of climate change happen many years after my death. Still a cause I believe in. So if I discover that I have terminal cancer and only 6 months to live, it's not like I'd stop caring about what happens to the people I love and the life projects after 6 months. I care about things that happen beyond the range of my mental experiences. All right, so something else must be happening here. Let's return to the example of the father and the son who were killed in the war. Do you really think the right thing to do is to deceive the father into believing that the son is still alive and living a happy life in Paris? We feel uneasy about this situation for the same reason that we feel uneasy about Cypher's fake life eating simulated steaks. The emotions that the father and Cypher experience are unwarranted. Emotions can be warranted or unwarranted. For example, you might be super afraid of beetles. You just might be terrified whenever you see a beetle in your house. You might go running away in fear. But that fear would not be warranted. Doesn't really make sense to be afraid of beetles. Sure, poisonous black widow spiders, you should be afraid of those. But beetles, by and large, I tried to look it up. I don't think there's any poisonous beetles. So you're pretty safe around beetles. So that's not a warranted fear. If you had the right set of beliefs, that fear would go away, right? You have a irrational fear of beetles. What I want to claim here is that happiness, just like fear or other emotions like anger, can be warranted or not warranted. Consider the father's experience of happiness when he thinks his son's living his life in Paris. That emotion is unwarranted because it's based on a false belief. So it's an unwarranted happiness, right? So if you accept the idea that a good life is not the same as a life full of happy mental experiences, then you should also accept the idea that you're not necessarily the best judge of whether you have a good life. You might be deceived. You might be completely wrong. You might think you have a happy life and it's not true at all. So let me give you some examples. Imagine two artists. One artist paints ugly paintings. I mean, they are hideous, but he was born with a trust fund and everyone is super nice to him. Everyone is constantly praising the quality of his art. His art instructors, museums, they all want him because his father's super rich. The artist is proud of his paintings, but this pride is completely unwarranted. The other artist is poor, but paints beautiful paintings. Unfortunately, his friends and family can't appreciate his art, so they're always mocking his stupid paintings. Ha ha ha. This artist is ashamed of his paintings, but his shame is unwarranted. Or let's imagine a more extreme example. Ronald is born into a very wealthy family, and he is born with lots and lots of money, billions. He decides, though, he wants to devote himself to a life of helping the sick and poor. Very admirable. Every day, he spends his time in a hospital in the worst slum on earth, tending to the sick. But it's all an illusion. What's happened is his family has constructed an elaborate set, creating a slum with their billions of dollars. All of the sick patients are actually actors, highly paid actors who are perfectly healthy. When Ronald discovers the ruse, he'll discover that his once meaningful life is now completely meaningless. So this poor guy spends all of his life doing something he thinks is worthwhile. One day, I don't know, someone let slip, oh, this has all been constructed. I'm sorry. All the stuff that you thought you were doing for a meaningful life, it's all a lie. So it seems strange to say that we might not be the best judge of the quality of our own life, but this judgment doesn't seem so strange if we accept the idea that the quality of our life is determined by something more than simply our mental states. reality also plays an important role here. So some philosophers have claimed that there's an important difference between what's called on the one hand psychological happiness and what's called on the other well-being, that these are two different concepts. So psychological happiness is really what I've been talking about most of the time in this talk. It's your mental state at a certain time, your emotional state or mood right now. Do you feel sad or depressed? Then you're not happy. If you feel proud that your son just got an A in math, then you feel happy. It's a psychological state. In 1881, the economist Francis Edgeworth imagined a new machine called a hedonmometer. He described it as, quote, an ideally perfect instrument, a psychophysical machine continually registering the height of pleasure experienced by an individual. So people could, he imagined this device people can go around with, and it's sort of like a, a detector that people use to detect whether, there's electricity behind the wall, then go around and figure out your happiness level by pointing it at people. So it would pick up on your moment by moment brain state and determine how happy you are. So that's psychological happiness. But this other concept, well-being, is all about an assessment of your entire life, your life as a whole, and not just a mental state or mood. So some of the surveys where they do country surveys on happiness level, they make an explicit distinction between these two different questions. They'll ask them both, how did you feel yesterday? And then they'll ask them a separate question, how do you assess your life overall? And so the idea is these are two different measures of happiness. So this distinction starts to make sense when you think about all of the miserable, painful things that people do to make themselves happy. So some of my favorite examples of that is Colin O'Brady. Does everyone know who Colin O'Brady is? He should be super famous at this point. I'll tell you who Colin O'Brady is. In 2018, Colin O'Brady walked 921 miles across Antarctica over 54 days, pulling a 400-pound sled through 50-mile-per-hour winds and negative 40 degrees Celsius temperatures. He completed the final 78 miles in one sleepless, nonstop 32-hour marathon. Had to be the most miserable experience. Well, there's probably worse, but one of the most miserable experiences ever experienced by a human. I mean, just to point out, the previous year, another British explorer named Henry Worsley died attempting to do the same thing. He got all the way, he got like within 30 miles of the end of the journey. And then within 30 miles, he had to call in for help, and the helicopters came, and then he died. So to make it all of that way across Antarctica and just not quite do it, that has to be, I don't know. I feel in some ways that's even worse. So think about this journey that Colin O'Brady did. So each moment of that 54-day trip, he must have been miserable. He was pulling a 400-pound sled. The temperature was 140 degrees, below zero Celsius. And he knew that the previous person who attempted to do this had died. So think about, sort of the mental trauma involved in doing that. Now, clearly, Colin did not perform this incredibly grueling journey to experience the moment-by-moment feeling of psychological happiness. That's just not possible there. And also, I want to point out, it's interesting that you can change the amount of happiness that Colin experienced by changing his belief. For example, if you showed Colin O'Brady a picture of a kindergarten field trip during which a set of average kindergartners completed the same 921-mile trek with little effort, and that would certainly take away some of Colin's sense of accomplishments. In other words, if a class of kindergartners could do the same thing, then you probably wouldn't feel the same level of achievement. So now I personally question whether this was a worthwhile pursuit. I mean, I've read Darwin on sexual selection. I know that why milk peacocks expend all that energy on giant feathers. So I can admire the fact that Colin was able to pull the 400 sled for 54 days without ever wanting to do it myself. But it is an interesting display of what motivates humans. All right, so getting to the conclusion. The goal of this talk was to answer the question, what makes a good life? In particular, I want to answer the question, is a good life the same as a happy life? Robert Nozick's thought experiment, The Experience Machine, makes us question whether a happy life is the same as a good life. We can imagine many situations in which a person is happy, but that happiness is not warranted. And we conclude that the person is not leading a good life. There's more to life than the moment-to-moment experience of psychological happiness. To have a good life, you also need to evaluate your life as a whole. When you evaluate your life, your evaluation relies on facts about reality. Truth matters for happiness. So let's discuss.